U.S. President Barack Obama has unveiled a defense strategy to expand the country's military presence in the Asia-Pacific region amid defense cuts. Xu Wenjing has more on this story.
It is a time of transition for the world's largest military power. To cope with budget cuts and transitional national security interests, the U.S. government is reducing spending in Europe and moving its military resources further east.
We will be strengthening our presence in the Asia-Pacific, and budget reductions will not come at the expense of that critical region.
The President's strategic review will reset defense priorities and guide defense budget cuts over the next decade. Despite the good relationship China and the U.S. hold, the review indicates the U.S. is too worried about the strategic intention of China's military buildup and thinks its rise could affect U.S. economy and security.
The Chinese are in a massive military buildup. Last year, they increased their defense spending by over 12%. In the next decade, while we decline, our defense spending declines and our forces shrink, that 12% multiplied will give them a tripling of their defense budget. Since they don't have to worry about other theaters, that means essentially they're now going to be a peer competitor.
The new strategy also seeks to improve U.S. capabilities in areas such as cyber warfare and missile defense. The detailed plan won't be available for several weeks. Xu Wenjing, CCTV.
Not satisfied with its missile shield in Europe, Washington has announced plans for a similar weapon system in Asia. A Pentagon official pointed at a perceived threat from North Korea as the main justification. But political activist and head of the New Patriotic Alliance, Renata Reyes, says that's a paper-thin excuse.
Clearly, the threat is being exaggerated by the United States, but we can see beyond the rhetoric that the real target here is China, and the U.S. wants to justify rebalancing most of its troops towards the Asian region. The so-called threats emanating from China are highly suspicious, questionable, and are in fact being twisted just so the U.S. can justify sending more troops and ships here in this region. Only intended to provide more justification for the permanent and expanded U.S. military presence in our region. That's another concern of ours. Will the U.S. missile shield provoke an arms race in the region? Would it provoke countries like China and North Korea into taking a tougher stance, into competing with the United States and deploying more war machines throughout Asia? And if that happens, that would be a bigger threat to peace.
I'm Deborah Kahn. Joining me now is Paul Burton, who is Asia Pacific Director at IHS Aerospace and Defense. Joining me now from Singapore. Okay, hi Paul. So obviously the U.S. bombers were able to fly in this area without incident, but in your opinion, how dangerous can the situation get?
Absolutely. Well, I think you have to view China's creation of this ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, on the backdrop of recent history, which really has seen an escalation of the tension in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, with all the major states surrounding it having competing claims to a number of islands there that they believe to be rich in natural resources. And I think that the United States response to China's creation of this ADIZ was probably unexpected in Beijing, and has certainly assisted in creating this tension that is now really taking root in this region.
Okay, so is it necessary for the U.S. to really take on the role of policing this region in support of Japan?
Yeah, I mean, U.S. has a long-standing agreement with Japan to de facto protect its territorial integrity from security threats. And I think one can view recent moves by the United States flying the B-52s from Guam over the ADIZ as part of that strategy. Whether or not the US views itself as a regional policeman, I think is open to interpretation. I think from Washington's perspective, they would say, look, all we're doing here is standing by our key ally in the region. Obviously, from Beijing's perspective, they can say, well, look, we have a national right to defend our airspace and our territorial integrity. And guess what? Japan has an ADIZ, South Korea, a lot of the surrounding states have these zones. Therefore, all we're doing is saying we have a right to create our own zone, and does the US then have a kind of a counter right, if you like, to fly in and out of it at will? Beijing will say no, Washington yes, and therefore we reach another kind of diplomatic impasse, if you like.
Okay, and this has been a long-standing dispute over the islands known as Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China. So China does appear to be becoming aggressive, a lot more aggressive lately. What would you expect next?
Well, I think we can see a continuation of this tit-for-tat exchange, if you like, between the various actors in the region. The IHS covers a global defence budget, and that's a key indicator, really, of how you can expect to see trends developing in the region. We're seeing budgets in Western Europe and America fall. We're seeing budgets in Asia Pacific rise. So we forecast between now and the end of the decade, Japan will spend around $400 billion on defence budgets, China around 975 billion, South Korea 300 billion. We're seeing a picture here of a region that is becoming increasingly militarized. China is developing increasing UAV capability, for example, that concerns the region. Japan is responding in kind, and it all just kind of develops a sense of uncertainty and insecurity in a region that is obviously pumping a lot of its cash into defence budgets and procurement. I think what prevents this from escalating to a kind of a classic military conflict is the depth of trade that you see between China and Japan. And although it's fallen this year by around 8 to 10%, it's still a significant amount, around 175, 180 billion US dollars. And I think that acts as a kind of a tacit guarantor that this doesn't escalate into more traditional warfare.
Okay, I know a lot of people in the region are certainly hoping so. So thanks very much. Paul Burton joining us from Singapore. For more on this story, you could go to WSJ.com. I'm Deborah Kahn.
China plans to use unmanned drones to increase its presence around the islands that are at the center of a volatile dispute with Japan. They will conduct marine surveillance of the area. 3 Chinese patrol vessels still remain very close to the uninhabited but strategic archipelago and have briefly entered waters which Japan considers its territory. The conflict's seen large-scale protests in both countries turn ugly. The row could be further complicated as Taiwanese boats are now heading to the islands to reassert their fishing rights in the area, while all around the U.S. is increasing its military activity in the region. For an expert's opinion on the story, I'm now joined live by James Corbett, editor of the Corbett Report website from Japan. Thank you, James, for joining us today. Now tell us, why is there so much deep-rooted interest in these tiny, uninhabited islands?
Well, ostensibly, this is about the potential oil and gas reserves that have been estimated to be in that area. So this is what the geopolitical calculus is about. But I think we have to understand this entire dispute not in terms of the islands themselves, which most average Japanese and average Chinese people, I think, don't really care about. I think this is being played up as a nationalist sentiment and nationalist fervor. And there's a couple of reasons for this. I think one of them is the political calculus that both countries are making right now. In fact, China is going through its once every 10 years leadership change. So we'll see Hu Jintao replaced by Xi Jinping later this year. And Japan was also going through an election cycle of sorts here, with the ruling Democratic Party of Japan having an internal leadership election. And I think both sides of that dispute, just like in any election cycle in the US or Russia or anywhere else in the world, the leaders like to play up their international prestige and talk tough to a perceived enemy or threat. during an election season or cycle, and I think that's part of what's been going on here. And I think also this the entire conflict gives both sides room to put out more of their pieces on the chessboard, as it were, so that China, for example, can use this as a cover to announce the deployment of drones in 2015, and Japan can use this as a chance to increase their military ties with the U.S.
Now, there's a third party that's also directly involved in the island row, and that's Taiwan. Where is it all heading? Will other countries get dragged in as well?
It is potentially, I suppose it is possible, depending on how this unfolds. And I think part of the underlying political calculus is that both sides wants this to be a big dispute in diplomatic terms, but I don't think either side is really looking for military confrontation at this point. So I think that would be a break on any sort of larger development going on here. But having said that, I think if there was to be